Rosenfield International Airport was bustling on Friday morning with sunlight streaming through the glass dome and casting shadows on the gleaming marble floor. Passengers filed through security gates, the hallways echoing with announcements, hurried footsteps, and the rhythmic roll of suitcase wheels on the ground. At the boarding gate for the Zurich, London flight, a girl stood quietly beside the digital screen displaying flight updates. Her name was Elena Hartmann, 17 years old, having just completed her first solo trip attending the European Youth Leadership Conference. In her hand were a Swiss passport and a paper ticket clearly printed with her name and itinerary. Elena wore a simple white shirt and dark jeans, neat but unassuming. Her light brown hair was braided to one side. Anyone looking at her would have seen an ordinary teenage girl, a little shy, a little hopeful. But anyone who had worked in aviation long enough would know that the name Hartmann was far from anonymous. Elena's father, Richard Hartmann, was the founder and current CEO of Blue Star Airways, one of the most respected airlines in Europe. Yet Elena had never relied on her family name. From a young age, she had been taught, reputation follows character, not the other way around. Elena stepped up to the check-in counter where a stern-faced blonde woman stood behind the glass desk. Her name tag read, Sandra Blake. "Good morning," Elena said politely, handing over her ticket and passport. Sandra glanced at them with a cold expression. She didn't return the greeting. Her eyes flicked quickly from the braid in Elena's hair to her sun-kissed skin and the name printed on the ticket. Her brows knit slightly. "Are you traveling alone?" Sandra asked, her voice flat. "Yes. I'm heading back to Zurich," Elena replied gently. Sandra held the ticket longer than necessary, raising it under the light. She turned back to her computer, typed something, and looked at Elena again, this time with suspicion. "This ticket isn't in the system. It might be fake." Her voice stiffened. Elena's heart skipped. "I confirmed this flight this morning through the airline's app. It was booked through my father's office." "And who is your father?" Sandra asked sharply. Elena hesitated for a moment. "Richard Hartmann." A brief silence followed. But instead of softening, Sandra gave a half-smirk laced with sarcasm. "Oh, that Richard Hartmann. Don't think throwing that name around will get you past me. I've seen plenty try to use someone else's reputation to slip through the cracks." Elena felt her chest tighten, but she kept her composure. "I'm not pretending to be anyone. That ticket is valid." Sandra said nothing. Then suddenly she tore the ticket in half right in front of Elena. The sound of ripping paper rang out sharply in the quiet airport. "Step aside. I'm not letting you board with a fake ticket." A few nearby passengers turned to look. Some frowned, others watched silently. Elena stood frozen, still holding the torn remains. Her face burned not just with anger, but humiliation. She bit her lip hard. She could have raised her voice. She could have shouted her father's name like a shield. But instead, she quietly stepped back, pulled out her phone, and made a call. Her father answered on the second ring. "Elena?" His voice was warm and steady. "Dad. They tore up my ticket. They won't let me board. They said it's fake." There was a tense pause on the other end. Richard spoke slowly, his voice low but firm. "Stay right there. Don't go anywhere. I'm coming." 30 minutes later, a black company car pulled up in front of the terminal. Richard Hartmann stepped out in a gray suit, his gaze sharp but his demeanor calm as though he were on a routine inspection. He walked straight to the check-in area where Elena still sat quietly by the window. Without a word, he held out his hand. Elena stood and placed the torn pieces of her ticket in his palm. His eyes darkened as he saw his daughter's name ripped in two. Richard asked to speak to the gate manager immediately. Within 5 minutes, he and Elena were escorted into a private meeting room. Sandra entered last, visibly uneasy. When questioned, she offered excuses. The ticket looked suspicious, the system didn't register it, the passenger seemed questionable. Richard did not raise his voice. He simply placed the two pieces of the ticket on the table and said, "If you were uncertain, you had every right to investigate further. But tearing a ticket and humiliating a passenger in public is a serious breach of service protocol. Regardless of who the passenger is, this behavior is unacceptable." Sandra remained silent. The floor manager nodded repeatedly, apologizing profusely. Richard turned to Elena. "Would you like to say something?" Elena took a deep breath. "I just want people like me, young, female, not in a business suit, to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. No one deserves to be shamed because of how they look or what name they carry." In that moment, Richard's eyes softened. He understood his daughter didn't need his protection, she needed his support. Once the issue was resolved, Elena was issued a new ticket, this time in business class. but not because she was Richard Hartmann's daughter, rather because she had held onto her dignity in the face of prejudice. As she sat in the aircraft cabin gazing out the small round window, Elena felt something had shifted. Not just the airline's attitude, but something inside her. And deep down, a quiet resolve began to form. Her story wasn't ending here. 2 days after returning to Zurich, Elena sat in the second-floor study of the Hartmann family's stately old villa. Outside, early spring snow drifted down lightly, blanketing the red-tiled roof in a soft layer of white. On the oak desk in front of her, her laptop screen glowed with a string of messages from the international friends she had made at the Youth Leadership Conference in Geneva. One message made her pause longer than the others. "Elena, I heard what happened to you at the airport. That's infuriating. But if you're planning to do something to change it, we're ready to help. Ingrid Geller, Germany." Elena quickly typed a reply. "I'm thinking of proposing a bias awareness and service culture training. Not just a box-ticking course, but something that really makes people reflect." She hit send and closed the laptop. Then she walked downstairs to her father's study, where he was in the middle of a video call with Blue Star's head of human resources. Richard saw her, muted his mic, and motioned her in with a wave. "I think we can do more than just deal with a single flight attendant," she said. He leaned back in his chair. "I think so too. But any proposal needs a foundation and a realistic plan." Elena sat across from him, her expression resolute. "Then let me propose one. I'll draft a practical training program involving experts, people I met in Geneva. We can pilot it at key airports first." Richard raised an eyebrow, a hint of pride curling one side of his mouth into a smile. "That's a big idea. But you'll need a proper plan, objectives, curriculum, budget, ways to measure success." "I'll do it," Elena said without hesitation. "And I don't want it to stand under the name of Richard Hartmann's daughter. I want this proposal to hold its own value." Richard nodded. "Then do it like a real reformer." 3 days later, Elena sat in a small cafe near Lake Zurich on a video call with her friends from the conference. Faces from all over the world appeared on her screen. Ingrid from Germany, a gender policy specialist; Omar from Belgium, a tech student and social activist; Layla, a French-Tunisian law student. Elena shared the first draft of her program. FlightAware, Seeing Beyond the Uniform, an internal training initiative focused on identifying unconscious bias in service environments, simulating real scenarios with diverse passengers, cross-disciplinary training with psychologists, cultural experts, and crisis management professionals, anonymous passenger feedback after each trial flight. Omar commented there should be a part where staff can share their own experiences too. "A lot of people who discriminate do it because they've been hurt themselves." Layla added, "And there have to be clear assessment criteria. It can't just be take the class and sign your name." Elena took notes, her eyes shining. When the call ended, she sent the updated version to her father, no longer a suggestion, but a full action plan. The following week, Richard formally presented the proposal to Blue Star's executive board. Some senior directors were hesitant, concerned about cost and effectiveness. But after hearing the presentation, led by Elena herself, the atmosphere in the room shifted. One Italian director stood up. "This young woman was humiliated by the system we oversee. If she has the courage to turn that experience into a reform initiative, then we have no excuse to turn her down." The proposal was approved, beginning with a pilot program at 3 major airports: Zurich, Frankfurt, and Lyon. That evening, Elena sat by her bedroom window, watching the city lights shimmer across the lake. In her hand was the torn ticket Sandra had ripped, now taped back together like a keepsake. Not to remember the shame, but to remember this. A careless act can spark a quiet revolution, if someone dares to begin. The FlightAware, Seeing Beyond the Uniform program officially launched at 3 key airports: Zurich, Switzerland; Frankfurt, Germany; and Lyon, France. Each location formed a pilot group of volunteers, flight attendants, ground staff, and management officers, all invited to participate on a voluntary basis. Elena arrived early at Zurich Airport on the first day of training. She wore a simple white shirt and a name badge that read, Elena H., Training Coordination Team. She didn't want to be recognized as the boss's daughter, but as part of a movement for change. The training room was small and well-lit. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing a large projector screen. A welcome sign at the door read, "Welcome to FlightAware." The first to walk in was an older flight attendant with silver hair, a straight posture, and sharp eyes. She glanced at Elena, then quietly took a seat in the last row. Elena recognized her, Greta Vollmer, 5-time winner of the Exemplary Attendant Award. a symbol of airline tradition. Next came a young Asian man named Min Tanaka, born and raised in France, working in the lost baggage department. He nodded politely at Elena as he entered. Gradually, around 20 participants filled the room, some curious, some guarded, some open-minded. Elena stood up to speak. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Elena. There will be no dry lectures today. We're here to talk, ask questions, and reflect on how we interact with passengers and with each other." A few heads nodded. Greta folded her arms without expression. The session began with a short video montage, passengers of all ethnicities, ages, and genders. Then a short interview clip. "Have you ever been misjudged the moment you stepped up to a check-in counter?" A quiet sigh rippled through the room. Elena asked, "Who here has seen a colleague treat a difficult passenger differently just because they were carrying a designer bag or wearing a business suit?" Min raised his hand. Another person followed. Then a clear voice cut through. "That's just natural reflex. We deal with thousands of people every day. We need some way to prioritize." It was Greta. Her eyes fixed firmly on Elena, unflinching. "Thank you, Ms. Greta," Elena replied calmly. "But my question is, can that kind of snap judgment make us overlook a passenger who genuinely needs help? Or worse, cause us to treat someone rudely just because they don't look the part?" Silence. Elena continued. "I'm not here to criticize anyone. I'm not perfect either. But I was once misjudged even with a valid ticket. I had that ticket torn up, right at the gate." A few surprised looks turned toward her. Greta raised an eyebrow slightly. "I'm not saying this to play victim," Elena added. "I'm saying it because, after that experience, I kept wondering, how many others have gone through the same thing but had no one to speak up for them?" The training continued with simulation exercises. One role-play involved participants acting as silent passengers while their partners responded using only body language and facial cues. Greta reluctantly participated. Playing the role of a flight attendant, she instinctively showed irritation toward a passenger pretending not to speak English. After the game, the facilitator asked, "Greta, did any emotion stand out to you?" She sighed and looked down at her hands. "I realized I was a bit impatient. And if that person really needed help, I probably made them feel like a burden." Elena gave a small smile, not of triumph, but of a crack forming in the wall of bias. After the session, many lingered behind. Min approached Elena and said quietly, "A passenger once called me a smuggler just because I didn't look Swiss enough. No one stood up for me back then. I'm grateful for today." Greta remained in the background, but just before leaving, she turned back and walked up to Elena. "You're Hartmann's daughter, aren't you?" Elena didn't deny it. "Yes. But I'm not here because of that." Greta looked at her, her expression unreadable. "I used to think young people were too soft. But today maybe I was wrong." Elena replied gently, "If we've been wrong but are still willing to reflect, then it's not too late." A week later, feedback reports from the 3 airports landed on the boardroom table. Over 70% of responses were positive. Several attendants voluntarily signed up for follow-up workshops. Richard Hartmann laid the report in front of Elena. "You've taken this beyond a CSR initiative. You're turning it into part of Blue Star's core culture." Elena, visibly tired but eyes still burning bright, replied, "We're 3 steps away from full system rollout." Richard nodded. "And you'll be the one leading us." Monday, 7 a.m., Blue Star Airways headquarters, Zurich. Elena entered the boardroom with a slim leather briefcase. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows on the pale stone floor. The room was cool, yet tense, with polite, cold glances that felt performative. Today's agenda: evaluating the scalability of the FlightAware program. Around the table sat regional directors, HR leads, union reps, and Marcus Keller, Central Europe director, known for his results-first philosophy. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began evenly. "Today, Elena will present the Phase 1 summary and her Phase 2 proposal. Elena, the floor is yours." Elena took a deep breath, opened her laptop, and projected her slides onto the main screen. She spoke clearly, concisely, backed by data. Employee satisfaction among pilot participants, 76% support continuing the program. Passenger ratings of markedly positive crew interactions rose by 21%. Zero discrimination-related complaints during the trial period across all 3 airports. Some nods around the table. But as she began to outline staffing and budget for expansion, Marcus smirked and cut in, tapping his pen. "Elena, those numbers are lovely. But let's be realistic, we're an airline, not a sociology institute." The room quieted. Elena met his gaze directly. "I believe customers choose us not just for speed, but for feeling seen, respected, and safe. And to achieve that, you want to send the entire crew to emotional boot camp? Reduce productivity? Raise training costs? Who takes responsibility when flights are delayed? His tone wasn't loud, but laced with doubt enough to seed hesitation. Martina, the regional director for Spain, offered a conciliatory voice. No one's denying the program's value. But Marcus has a point. Without clear cost and integration plans, this risks being labeled a burden. Richard remained silent, watching Elena as if to ask, "How will you respond?" Elena clenched her hands under the table, then responded calmly. "I understand the concern. That's why I've worked with finance to develop 3 implementation models: full rollout, phased approach, and a hybrid model." She advanced the slide. Charts, budgets, timelines appeared. "I'm not asking for everything at once, but I am asking that we not abandon the goal just because it's difficult." Marcus folded his arms, unreadable. Elena stepped slowly along the table. "Aviation is a high-tech industry, but it's also one of the most human-facing. If we don't train our staff to see the person behind the ticket, then we're running machines, not delivering experiences." No one spoke. Even Marcus didn't object this time. He looked down at the documents, not in agreement, but not in rejection. Richard smiled. "I propose we vote. Do we proceed with Phase 2 under the hybrid model?" Result: 9 in favor, 3 against. Proposal approved. Elena exhaled, but she knew this wasn't the end. Just the first front in a long battle against inertia and fear of change. That evening, back in Richard's office, he said quietly, "You know, Marcus has influence. You won a round, but he won't stay silent for long." "I'm not afraid to argue," Elena replied, "if it makes this organization better." Richard smiled, not relaxed, but the smile of someone who had wrestled with systems for years. "Just remember, real change doesn't come from a single meeting. It comes from those who listen and dare to act daily." Elena looked out the window where planes silently took off into the sky. She thought, headwinds may slow an aircraft, but they also lift it higher. Mid-April. In a small meeting room at Blue Star's HR division, Elena sat across from Clara Meinhardt, head of internal program evaluation. Clara, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, spoke slowly but firmly. In her hands were freshly printed staff feedback reports. "I don't want to disappoint you, Elena," she began, placing the stack on the table. "But in the past 3 weeks, negative feedback from Central Europe staff has tripled." Elena leaned forward. "What's in the feedback?" Clara read. "The program is unrealistic, a waste of time with no real skills taught. I feel forced to think I'm biased, even though I've never been reported. This is a PR stunt, not a real improvement tool." Elena flipped through the pages and noticed something strange. The wording was nearly identical. The IP addresses were internal. Most came from Frankfurt, Marcus Keller's region. She exhaled slowly. "Clara, can your team verify the authenticity of these submissions? Something feels off." Clara nodded, her eyes flickering with recognition. "I had suspicions too. We're already investigating." That same day, Elena received an anonymous email. No subject, no signature, just one line. "Beware those who don't resist in words but through structure." She read it over and over, her mind taut as a wire. She wasn't one for paranoia, but instinct screamed a covert sabotage was underway. 2 days later, at the Lion trial site, Elena arrived to observe a training session only to find the classroom empty. A receptionist approached, apologetic. "I'm sorry, Ms. Hartmann. 18 people were on the list, but only 2 showed up. The rest reported urgent meetings from operations." Elena nodded, eyes fixed on the attendance sheet. The names belonged to people who'd previously given positive feedback. She didn't believe their absence was voluntary. She took a photo, then immediately tried calling Lion's HR lead. No answer. For the first time since launching the initiative, Elena felt the chill of organizational silence, like invisible walls quietly closing in. That evening, she told Richard everything. He sat, fingers steepled under his chin, gaze thoughtful. "You've just stepped into what people call systemic resistance." Systemic resistance? No one confronts you directly, but they'll pull resources, overbook meetings, reassign your allies, and the program will suffocate legally. Elena's fists clenched. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Why? Because they're afraid of change?" Richard nodded. "Partly. And partly because you're proving that influence doesn't just come from title, it comes from trust. And that makes some people lose control." Elena looked at her father, a storm of resolve rising inside her, part fury, part clarity. "I won't stop." "Then you'll have to learn to play chess," he said. "Play by the rules, but understand, your power isn't just in ideas. It's in alliances. The next morning, Elena sent a series of personal messages to silent allies Min Tanaka, Greta Vollmer, team leads she'd worked with. The message was brief, but pointed. If you still believe in flight aware, I need you to speak, not in the shadows, but where it can be seen. She wasn't sure how many would respond. But within hours, her inbox lit up. An open letter from Greta. After 20 years as a flight attendant, I stand with Elena Hartmann. A short video from Min. I stayed silent out of fear. But I can't stay on the sidelines anymore. An internal memo from Clara. We've verified the reports. Some anonymous feedback was fabricated. A fire rekindled in Elena's heart. She knew the battle had shifted from a test program to a war for trust. And she was ready to play black or white. The undercurrent had surfaced. Just days after Elena's team released the verification results exposing fake feedback originating from the Frankfurt branch, an anonymous article appeared on one of Europe's largest aviation industry forums. The title was ice cold. FlightAware, a PR project in disguise by the CEO's daughter? The anonymous author raised pointed questions. How could someone under 18 be given authority to design training policy? Was Blue Star hiding behind the slogan of cultural innovation to boost internal image? Were the positive feedback reports manipulated by Elena's own team? There was no concrete evidence, just insinuations. But it spread like wildfire. Questions that didn't need answers, only doubt. The media jumped in. Major newspapers demanded an official response from Blue Star. Some reporters even appeared at Richard Hartmann's home. In an emergency executive meeting, several directors voiced concern. We should freeze the program until the public backlash cools down. The media's questioning our ethical standards. Richard looked around the table and replied slowly. I won't let an anonymous article dictate the course of a company-wide reform. But this time I won't be the one to speak for it. He turned to Elena. Are you ready? Elena tightened her grip. Her eyes lit with determination. I won't hide behind anyone anymore. 3 days later, Elena appeared in a live evening interview on Switzerland's national television. The topic: Youth and Reform, should the future of companies be placed in their hands? Elena wore a soft pink blazer, no company logos, no flashy accessories. She represented herself, no more, no less. The host, a veteran journalist named Dietrich, opened with a sharp-edged question. Ms. Hartmann, let's be direct, if you weren't the daughter of Richard Hartmann, would you be speaking here today? Elena looked directly into the camera. If I weren't his daughter, I might still have ideas. But perhaps no one would listen. I don't deny the privilege I have, I try to use it to create something others couldn't, a doorway. Dietrich pressed on. Are you aware that many in the industry feel your program undermines their pride by subtly accusing them of being biased? Elena nodded. I understand. Because unconscious bias isn't an accusation, it's an invitation to reflect. And if I've been hurt by prejudice, why shouldn't others reflect on how they behave? The studio fell silent. Dietrich raised an eyebrow. Do you have a goal beyond FlightAware? Elena gave a soft smile. I don't dream of being a symbol. I just want people like me, those who've had their tickets torn, who've been doubted because of their name or their face, to be treated like human beings. The interview ended with a light round of applause from some studio guests. The next day, news outlets published excerpts under headlines like, Elena Hartmann, not seeking to be a symbol, just to preserve dignity. At Blue Star headquarters, the internal email system lit up like fireworks. Those who had hesitated now began sending notes of support. Several mid-level managers who had remained silent now volunteered to join the Phase 2 rollout team. Most surprising of all, Marcus Keller sent an invitation for a private meeting. They met at the ground floor cafe of headquarters, a place where nothing could be hidden. Marcus arrived, adjusted his tie, and sat across from Elena. You're better than I expected, he said plainly. Elena shrugged. Thanks. I'll take that as a compliment. Marcus gave a wry smile. I still don't fully believe your program is a long-term solution. But now I believe ignoring it would be a strategic mistake. Elena looked at him, eyes sharp. So what do you want? Marcus met her gaze squarely. I want to cooperate. I'll take responsibility for implementing the program in Central Europe professionally, without sentiment, and without turning it into a trend. Elena paused for a few seconds, then held out her hand. As long as you don't distort its spirit, then I agree. That night, Elena typed into her laptop, journaling the day's events. When the storm of public opinion rolls in, the only thing that keeps a program standing isn't justification. It's real value and the courage to step into the light. Not wearing medals, but carrying only the truth. Summer arrived early in Zurich. Golden sunlight stretched over cobbled streets, across the terracotta roofs of Blue Star headquarters and onto the first flights of the day lifting off from runway 3, bound for every continent. On the 12th floor, Elena stood by the glass window holding a freshly printed report still warm from the machine. Outside, the sky opened endlessly, but in her mind were numbers, charts, and one persistent question. Will what I'm building outlive me? It had been 3 months since the Flight Aware program was approved for expansion. What began as a modest pilot was now active in over 22 airports and 8 operations centers across Blue Star. Nearly 4,800 employees had undergone the training, with a 92% completion rate. Feedback was overwhelmingly positive. But Elena knew short-term success doesn't guarantee lasting change. Many initiatives had been loudly praised only to quietly vanish a few financial quarters later. She needed a bigger move. She needed to shift the program from an event to a standard. That day, Elena presented a bold new proposal to the senior executive board. Establish a service culture division as a permanent structure within Blue Star's operational system. No longer just a project. No longer something tied to her name, but a real department with its own budget, personnel, KPIs, and authority to plan regular training. She spoke in a calm but weighty voice. Flight Aware shouldn't be the program of one person or one phase. It should become the spiritual backbone of Blue Star. A standalone division capable of monitoring not just service behavior, but the culture of dialogue, feedback, and our internal value system. Some in the room leaned back, exchanging glances. Others remained silent, not rejecting, but not yet convinced. Marcus Keller was the first to speak. You're proposing a new management layer. A department that generates no revenue. A team to evaluate attitude, something you can't measure in profit. Elena nodded. Yes. But it's precisely those immeasurable things that generate customer trust, the kind that keeps people coming back, loyal, and willing to pay for something intangible. Another executive, Sofia Montero, regional director for Latin America, rested her chin in one hand and asked gently, Elena, I don't deny your value. But I need to ask, if you leave the company or your father retires, who ensures this survives? How do we know this isn't a personal legacy but an enduring structure? Elena smiled. That was the very question she had pondered for weeks. That's why I haven't put my name on any official document in this proposal. And I've invited 3 independent experts, not Blue Star employees, to join the founding advisory council of the Service Culture Division. She clicked the remote. The screen behind her lit up with 3 faces. Dr. Maya Okeke, a Nigerian-Swiss organizational psychologist. Lucas Tremblay, a cross-cultural communication researcher from the University of Montreal. Ingrid Geller, the social activist Elena had met at the Youth Leadership Summit. None of them owe me anything, but they believe in what I believe. And they are committed to defending it even if I'm no longer here. The room fell quiet. A quiet kind of respect filled the air. Richard Hartmann said nothing. He let his daughter stand on her own. By the end of the meeting, the board approved the Service Culture Division as a strategic company-level unit. That afternoon, in the garden at home, Elena read feedback from HR teams in Brazil, Japan, Kenya. They had begun using a new soft feedback tool, a system developed by her team to measure cultural sentiment scores across internal departments. Each week, employees received a random question, like, when was the last time you felt misjudged at work? Would you feel safe giving critical feedback to a superior about service behavior? Who in your team makes you feel heard? The data was encrypted, analyzed by AI, not for punishment, but to identify cultural friction points. Richard walked into the garden carrying 2 glasses of mint tea. He set one beside Elena and said, Tomorrow, Blue Star turns 40. And you just laid the first stone for the next 40 years. Elena took a sip. I'm not sure I'll stay with the company for 40 years like you did. Richard smiled. You don't have to. But if the culture you built still stands when you're gone, then it's bigger than time. Bigger than power. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to him and asked softly, Do you think sometimes the most important changes begin from something really small? Richard nodded. A torn ticket. A dismissive glance. A silent passenger. Or a girl who simply refused to stay silent anymore. Elena smiled. A soft summer breeze rustled through the treetops, carrying with it the scent of mint, the warmth of sunlight, and something unseen but unmistakably real. A legacy was taking shape. Autumn arrived early in Zurich. Maple leaves painted gold along the paths leading to Blue Star headquarters. The city air was cool and gentle. A sharp contrast to the whirlwind in Elena Hartmann's mind. She sat alone in the rooftop conference room, the one with a balcony that faced the distant Alps. In her hands was a freshly printed letter, an invitation from a global nonprofit, the World Alliance for Equitable Service, a cross-sector coalition focused on fairness and equity in service environments. They weren't inviting her as a speaker, not as a representative of Blue Star, but as herself, Elena, the woman who had built an internal initiative and turned it into a cultural system within a global corporation. We believe your vision could benefit organizations far beyond aviation. We'd like to invite you to become a co-founder of our European division. Elena reread the letter, heart beating quietly but deeply. From the first day she launched FlightAware, she never imagined it would take her beyond its origin. But now, a new door was opening, to a world where influence didn't depend on a name, but on vision and courage. The next day, she stepped into Richard Hartmann's office with a folder in hand. He was reading the quarterly financial report, but folded it away the moment he saw her. "I know that look," he said, smiling. "That's the look of someone about to resign." Elena laughed. "What would you think if I said I'm leaving Blue Star?" Richard tilted his head. "I'd think, if you're doing it just to prove your independence, you might be mistaken. But if you're doing it because your mission now stretches beyond what Blue Star can offer, then I fully support you." She placed the folder on his desk. "I'm not abandoning FlightAware. I just want it to be a seed, not a cage." Richard was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Then I believe it's time you choose your own path." 2 weeks later, the news broke internally, then hit the press. Headlines read, "CEO's daughter leaves Blue Star to pursue global equity in service." Creator of FlightAware launches cross-industry cultural initiative. The media paid attention, but more importantly, so did the service industry. Within a month, Elena received consulting offers from a major hotel chain in Spain, a high-speed rail group in Japan, and an insurance firm in France. All asked the same question: can something like FlightAware work in our industry? But Elena didn't rush to say yes. Instead, she focused on building the foundation of her new organization, EquiCircle, a team of multidisciplinary experts dedicated to developing tools for cultural training, communication, and anti-bias strategies across service environments. For the first time, she had no protection from her father's name, no in-house PR team, no Blue Star ID card, just her ideas, her network, and her belief that kindness could become a standard if designed the right way. One late night in Berlin, in a small rented apartment, Elena opened her laptop and video called EquiCircle's founding team. Present on the screen were Ingrid, her friend from Geneva, now program director for the EU; Malik, a former airport security officer, now coordinating employee-client communication in public services; Dr. Maya Okeke, now strategic advisor, helping to develop a scale for measuring microaggressions in multicultural environments. They discussed their first project outside of aviation, creating Culture Check, a toolkit for a private hospital network where foreign patients were often overlooked or misdiagnosed due to language barriers and bias. Ingrid said through the screen, "Elena, do you realize what you're doing? You're rewriting how the entire service industry speaks to human beings." Elena smiled. "I'm not rewriting anything. I'm just asking the questions we should have been asking all along." She looked at the screen, saw their steady, unwavering eyes. And for the first time since leaving Blue Star, she didn't feel like she was representing her father's company, but a new generation, one that refused to stay silent when wrong became routine. That night, she wrote in her journal, "I left behind the name, but not the values my father taught me. Never hold your head high because of privilege. Stand firm because of integrity and doing what's right." Winter in Warsaw was so cold, felt like even words froze as they left your mouth. Elena stood in front of the auditorium of one of Poland's largest private hospitals, a folder in hand, her expression calm, though inside her mind, a storm was brewing. Today marked the launch of Culture Check, the first trial run of EquiCircle's program aimed at improving communication between medical staff and patients in multicultural environments. This project was unique for 3 reasons. The hospital had recently been embroiled in a scandal involving discriminatory treatment of Middle Eastern patients. Most of the medical staff had worked there for years, many holding deeply entrenched conservative views. And most critically, none of them had requested this program. It had been imposed by the board, following pressure from international shareholders. In other words, Elena and her team were not welcome. The opening session took place in a large conference room with fluorescent lights and cold leather chairs. About 30 people showed up. Almost all crossed their arms, keeping their distance, not because of COVID, but because of defensiveness. Elena stood by the projector screen with Malik and Ingrid beside her. She began not with a lecture, but with a reflection. I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong. I'm here because I believe that if any of you have ever felt misunderstood, misjudged, then perhaps you can also imagine what it's like to accidentally do that to someone else. An older doctor chuckled quietly, openly sarcastic. You come from Switzerland. Have you ever worked 24 shifts in a week, heard 5 languages, and still had to save lives in 10 minutes? Elena nodded. No, I've never been a doctor, and that's exactly why I'm here to learn, not to teach. But I do know what it feels like to be treated as a problem instead of a person. The room quieted. No one smiled, but a few eyes softened. Over the next 2 days, they conducted role plays, anonymous feedback rounds, and open Q&A sessions. In a small discussion group, a young nurse shared, I used to think an Afghan patient was being deliberately uncooperative. But after this session, I learned, in his culture, avoiding eye contact with a woman is a form of respect, not rudeness. A front desk staffer added, I once joked about the name of a patient from Africa. I assumed they didn't understand Polish, but now I realize their silence wasn't ignorance. It was familiarity with being disrespected. But not everyone changed. In a confidential feedback form, one middle-aged doctor wrote, I don't care about patients' feelings. I'm paid to cure people, not to be a cultural therapist. Reading that, Elena didn't feel angry. She felt sad. But she also understood. You can't ask people to change if they're not ready to give up control. In the final week of the trial, Elena hosted a dialogue session, for the first time bringing staff and patients into the same room. Not as doctor and patient, but as human beings. A Syrian man stood up, his arm still bandaged post-surgery. He spoke slowly in English through an interpreter. I was attacked in my homeland for my beliefs. Here I feel ignored because of my language. I don't need anyone's apology. I just want to be called by my real name, not that guy. The room fell completely silent. A few eyes lowered. Elena knew that moment did more than 10 PowerPoint slides ever could. After the session, one of the doctors stepped outside and stopped Elena. It was the same one who had mocked her on the first day. His voice was low. I still don't like your program, but I respect that. You didn't leave when we turned cold. Elena smiled gently. I don't need to be liked. I just need people to believe that kindness doesn't slow efficiency. It accelerates it in the long run. The doctor gave a small nod. Maybe. After 3 weeks, the culture check pilot in Warsaw concluded. The internal report showed positive feedback rose from 34% to 68%. Complaints about staff attitude dropped by 41%. A group of nurses voluntarily created an intercultural dialogue club, the first of its kind in the hospital system. But more importantly, beacons had been lit. Not dazzling, but steady. And Elena knew, in cold environments, sometimes a small light matters more than a big promise. That night, in the living room of her rented apartment in Warsaw, Elena wrote a handwritten letter to her 14-year-old self, the girl who had her ticket torn at the airport. You didn't cry. You didn't scream. But you stood your ground. And from that moment on, you learned this. They can tear a piece of paper from your hand, but no one can shred your dignity unless you give it away. You didn't become someone grand. You just learned how to hold on to your light and pass it to others who had learned to live in the dark. She placed the letter inside a notebook, marking the page with a dried maple leaf. Outside, Warsaw was easing into Christmas. The streetlights blinked like little lighthouses, quiet but never off course. March, Berlin. The news spread across social media like a spring storm, sudden, swift, and impossible to stop. A former EquiCircle collaborator, once part of the advisory team for the African region, had publicly accused the organization of imposing Western cultural frameworks during its rollout at a hospital in Nairobi. The accusation, a lack of local consultation and cultural imposition disguised as kindness. Within 12 hours, an international blog published an article titled, "When Kindness Carries the Face of Soft Colonialism?" It raised hard, piercing questions. Was EquiCircle unintentionally replicating systems of cultural dominance under the banner of goodwill? Were some of its training materials inappropriate or tone-deaf to African contexts? And most pointedly, was Elena Hartmann guilty of a Western-centered lens and a lack of cross-cultural humility? At that moment, Elena was on a flight from Munich to Copenhagen when the messages began. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, notifications, emails, comments. A few were curious or constructive, but the majority carried anger, sarcasm, or suspicion. For the first time in years, she felt afraid. Not afraid of losing her reputation, but afraid that she had become what she once fought against. A loud voice drowning out smaller ones. A system acting before listening. 3 days later, Elena called an emergency global meeting online with nearly 200 EquiCircle staff and collaborators from over 20 countries. There were no slides, no charts. Just her standing in front of the camera, hands empty. "I'm sorry," she said. Right from the start. The screen went silent. "I'm sorry that our expansion outpaced our listening. I'm sorry I didn't recognize that sometimes what we call help can look and feel like control. And I'm especially sorry that I didn't ask. What should we learn from you?" Before I said, "Here's how we can help." Some cameras turned off. Others turned on. Ingrid stayed quiet, her expression tense. Malik gave the faintest nod. Elena continued, "I won't defend what happened, but I will act. We will suspend all rollouts outside of Europe. We will invite local leaders as co-designers, not just reviewers. And we will host an open international summit not to celebrate success, but to confront our failures." She drew a breath. If EquiCircle cannot be an organization that learns from its own mistakes, then we have no right to lead anyone. 1 month later, the summit, titled Against the Light, was held in Amsterdam. No grand stage. No star-studded speaker list. Just real stories from real people. A nurse from Kenya, a passenger from Bangladesh, a receptionist from Chile. Elena didn't host the event. She didn't give a keynote. She sat in the front row, listening, taking notes, and apologizing to those who came to speak with her. A young Nigerian speaker said something Elena would never forget. "You weren't wrong to build EquiCircle, but if you don't let it grow beyond you, it'll die under your shadow." After the summit, Elena stood on a high balcony overlooking the still waters of Amsterdam's canals. Ingrid stepped beside her. "Do you regret it?" Ingrid asked. Elena thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, but I realize I'm no longer someone who's changing the world. I'm just someone learning to take responsibility for thinking I could." Ingrid smiled. Maybe that's the biggest change of all. A few months later, EquiCircle restructured. Elena stepped down as CEO. She remained as a founding member of the steering council, passing leadership to a team representing multiple cultural regions. She began to write, not speeches, not strategic briefs, but a book titled, Beyond Being Right, When Ideals Learn to Bow. It wasn't a book about success. It was a book about all the times Elena had been wrong, the times she thought she was helping and wasn't, the moments she was criticized and grew from it. It didn't become a bestseller right away. But at a quiet signing event in Oslo, a young woman from Pakistan approached, placed the book on the table, and said, "I used to think you were a hypocrite. Now I think you're someone brave enough to be imperfect. And that gives me courage." Elena smiled, signed the book, and added one sentence. "Courage isn't about always being right. It's about not walking away when you're wrong." At last, Elena understood something more deeply than ever before. Kindness is not a destination. It's a journey. And that journey includes mistakes, stumbles. But each time we rise again, we move one step closer toward our humanity.